Why do the tree cross the road? To adapt to climate change. It's not much of a joke. In fact, it's possibly not a joke at all. But I wanted to highlight the need for corridors for wildlife, which includes our plants. They're really, really important. And now you may be wondering how trees cross roads. Well, you need to think beyond the individual tree to the tree's offspring. So this is the seeds, the suckers, the ways that the tree reproduces. And what we've been seeing is that trees in the northern hemisphere are moving northwards as the climate's warming, as the land temperatures are getting warmer, to the point where it's quite possible in the future that we won't have beech trees in southern England. It will just be too warm for them. They're not sun lovers, beech trees, and so it's very sad. And something that I really hope doesn't happen. I hope that we're able to do something about it. But there's a real possibility that's in our future. So really, every tenth of a degree matters if we're to keep the neighbours that we hold so dearly. But yes, so coming back to my point about the importance of corridors, and really why wildlife gardening matters. Gardens aren't suitable for every species. There are limits to what we can do within the garden, but there are possibilities within our built spaces. So it does come down to more than just wildlife gardening. It comes down to what we're doing in our communities, what we're doing in terms of planning, and how we think of our urban spaces and our suburban spaces. One of the things that's come up quite a lot is why we need to have these wild verges, why we need to have wildlife gardens when there's nature reserves, national parks, and those places that people are seeing the big habitat projects as being the places where wild nature is, and then cities and towns are separate, and that they should be sort of tidy and look a certain way. That this idea of a cared for garden is one where weeds have been taken out, and certain plants have been put in, and it's very controlled. But I really want to maybe help to change some of the thinking around that. Our gardens are a great place to start in terms of providing a refuge, providing habitat, and providing this really important connectivity. And just to really expand on that, there are a couple of reasons why it's really important. There's a long-term picture, which is the trees crossing the road. So this is not looking at individual species, but looking at what happens on a sort of generational basis. So the ability to sort of disperse and reproduce, and come into contact with others of their kind. So that we haven't got sort of really isolated populations, because it's really important that there's mixing of different populations, that they're not, otherwise we end up with things like inbreeding, thinking about sort of animals and things. Then there's the more short term, the more acute thing. So when we have wildfires and flooding, the animals need somewhere to go. So in the past year, lots of people were finding that there were adders in their gardens because they needed to escape wildfires. So they wouldn't normally perhaps come into people's gardens, but because people had very kindly got porous fencing, porous boundaries, they were able to escape. And adders are one of the really lovely species that we have in the UK, the six reptile species that we have, who are struggling. So wildfire could be really bad news for them and lots of other species as well. I mean, it's not just the adders that we're managing to escape But yeah, really important. So, you know, one of the things that came up in our survey, the wildlife gardening survey, was this belief that if your boundaries onto or there's nearby sort of woodland, or somebody even I think mentioned sort of fields, you know, agricultural fields, there was a perception that those spaces are rich with biodiversity, and so you don't need a wildlife garden because, you know, there's plenty going on already. And actually, I would argue that the wildlife garden helps, or, you know, being a good neighbour by having a great space and making a corridor, you're actually giving a kind of buffer, you know, and it's protecting that really rich habitat. So even if you are in the vicinity of a nature reserve, your wildlife garden, not only will you be able to enjoy the wildlife without actually having to go into the reserve, so you'll find you get fabulous visitors in your garden, but you're also helping with that dispersal, you know, with them being able to be more mobile, with them being more resilient and addressing when things happen, like the wildfires, for instance. And by not doing certain things, such as not using pesticides, not having maybe lots of plastic, you know, those sorts of things, you're being a good neighbour to the reserve. You know, you're being a good neighbour to the wildlife next door. So yeah, I really want to maybe start a conversation where we're thinking a bit differently about how we can be good neighbours, and, you know, our sort of role as stewards of the space that we're occupying, and yeah, basically how we can help, not just with climate change, with habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, you know, the biodiversity crisis. It's yeah, really important. Thank you for listening, and sorry about the terrible joke.